The cold was a living thing. It bit at Thea's exposed skin, a vicious, personal attack that seeped through the thin fabric of her coat. Snow fell in thick, silent curtains, muffling the world and turning the city into a ghost of itself. At 21, she was used to the bone-deep weariness that followed a 12-hour shift, but this kind of cold was different. It felt lonely. She pulled her dark green scrubs tighter at the collar of her jacket, the hospital's familiar scent of faint comfort against the biting wind. She was just a few blocks from her small apartment, dreaming of a hot shower and the blessed oblivion of sleep, when a sound snagged her attention. It was a weak, desperate noise, almost lost in the whisper of the falling snow. She stopped, her head tilted, listening. It came again, a thin whimper from the direction of the park's grand, ornamental fountain, now a grotesque sculpture of ice. Her training, the instinct to move toward distress, overrode her exhaustion. She pushed through the knee-deep snow, her boots crunching a frantic rhythm. And then she saw him. A small boy, no older than 10, was in the frozen basin of the fountain, half submerged in the sliver of black water that hadn't yet turned to solid ice. His dark hair was matted with snow, his face a shocking, porcelain white against the encroaching dusk. He was barely moving. Time seemed to stop. Thea didn't think, she acted. She scrambled over the icy lip of the fountain, the freezing water instantly soaking her pants and sending a jolt of pain up her legs. "Hey," she called out, her voice gentle but firm, the way she spoke to frightened patients. "Hey, I'm here. I'm going to help you." She reached for him, her fingers numb, and pulled his small, terrifyingly light body from the water. He was shivering violently, his lips a bruised shade of blue. She stripped off her own coat without a second thought, wrapping it around his tiny frame, and cradled him against her chest, trying to force her own body heat into his. She checked his pulse, his breathing thready but there. With one hand, she fumbled for her phone, her fingers clumsy with cold, and dialed for an ambulance, her voice miraculously steady as she gave their location. She held the boy close, whispering promises into his cold, flushed ear. "You're okay. You're going to be okay. Just hold on." The world narrowed to the small, shivering child in her arms and the distant, hopeful siren growing steadily closer. The hospital was an assault of bright lights and sterile warmth after the frigid darkness of the park. Thea refused to leave the boy's side, a silent, stubborn shadow in her damp, dark green scrubs. She followed the gurney into the emergency bay, answering the doctor's rapid-fire questions with a calm precision that belied the frantic terror still thrumming in her veins. His name was Min-jun, they learned from a small tag on his jacket zipper, but he was otherwise a mystery. He was suffering from severe hypothermia, but his vitals were stabilizing. He was going to make it. Even after he was settled in a pediatric room, warmed and hooked up to monitors that beeped a steady, reassuring rhythm, Thea couldn't bring herself to leave. She sat in the stiff visitor's chair, her own shivering finally subsiding, and held his small, cool hand. She watched the slow rise and fall of his chest, her heart aching for this silent, unknown child who had felt so fragile in her arms. Hours bled into one another. Her shift was long over, but the thought of going home felt wrong, like abandoning a post. Then, the atmosphere in the quiet hallway shifted. A palpable tension rolled in like a storm front. Thea looked up to see a group of men moving down the corridor. They were all dressed in immaculate dark suits, their faces hard and unreadable, their presence sucking the very air from the space. They moved with a silent, coordinated purpose that was deeply unsettling. At their center walked a man who commanded the space without a word. He was tall and impeccably dressed, his face a masterpiece of controlled anguish. Every line of him was rigid, from his sharp jaw to his clenched fists. He stopped in the doorway of Min-jun's room, and his eyes, dark and piercing, landed on his son. For a single, shattering moment, the mask of control fractured, revealing a raw, terrifying vulnerability. Then his gaze snapped to Thea. It was cold, accusatory, and utterly intimidating. He didn't see a rescuer. He saw a stranger, a loose thread in his tightly controlled world, and her hand was holding his son's. The unspoken question hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. "Who are you? And what are you doing here?" Jin-woo Kwon moved into the room, his silent entourage forming a human wall at the door. He didn't look at the doctors or the nurses who hovered nervously nearby. His entire world had contracted to the small boy in the bed and the young woman sitting beside him. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, chilling whisper, devoid of warmth but thrumming with tightly leashed power. "Who are you?" It wasn't a question. It was a demand for an explanation, for a place in his narrative. Thea met his gaze, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a surge of protective instinct. She gently released Minjun's hand and stood, her posture straight, her chin up. "My name is Thea. I'm a nurse here. I found him in the fountain at the park." She kept her voice even, professional, refusing to be cowed by the implicit threat in his stance. Jin-woo's eyes swept over her, taking in the damp scrubs, the fatigue etched around her eyes, the quiet defiance in her expression. He was a man accustomed to people shrinking under his gaze, yet she stood her ground. "What happened?" he pressed, his voice like stones grinding together. She recounted the events with clinical precision, the sound she heard, the state she found Minjun in, the immediate actions she took. She left out the terror, the searing cold, the desperate prayers she had whispered. She gave him only the facts, a neat, professional report. He listened without interruption, his expression an unreadable mask of granite. He was processing, analyzing, searching for any inconsistency, any sign of a threat. He was a predator assessing his environment, and she was an unknown variable. When she finished, he gave a short, sharp nod. It was not a thank you. It was a dismissal. He turned his back on her, his entire focus shifting to his son. He sat where she had been sitting, his large hand tentatively reaching out to brush a stray strand of hair from Minjun's forehead. The gesture was so full of aching tenderness it seemed completely at odds with the cold, dangerous man he presented to the world. Thea felt a complex knot of emotions tighten in her chest, anger at his rudeness, but also a profound, unexpected wave of sympathy. She quietly backed out of the room, past the stone-faced guards, and finally headed home, the image of the powerful, broken father and his silent, sleeping son burned into her mind. A few days passed in a blur of long shifts and restless sleep. Thea tried to push the incident from her mind, to file it away as another traumatic night in a career that would surely be full of them. She called the pediatric ward once, anonymously, and was told that the boy, Minjun, had been discharged. She felt a pang of something she couldn't name, relief, but also a strange sense of loss. She was in her tiny, cluttered apartment, sipping tea while her best friend, Chloe, lectured her from the worn floral armchair. "I'm telling you, Thea, you need to let this go. You did a good thing, a heroic thing. But these are not people you want in your life. A guy who shows up with a squad of goons in suits? That screams trouble," Thea sighed, tracing the rim of her mug. "I know. It's just the boy. He looked so alone, Chloe." Even with his father right there, before Chloe could respond, the sleek, imposing silhouette of a black sedan slid to a stop outside her building. It was the kind of car that didn't belong on her street, a silent, black shark in a pond of minnows. A moment later, there was a firm, polite knock on her door. Thea's heart hammered against her ribs. She shared a wide-eyed look with Chloe before opening the door a crack. One of Jin-woo Kwon's men stood there, his expression impassive, his suit just as immaculate as it had been in the hospital. He didn't try to force his way in. He simply spoke, his voice calm and formal. "Miss Thea? Mr. Kwon requests a moment of your time." It sounded polite, but the weight behind the words made it clear this was not a request she could easily refuse. He presented an offer. Mr. Kwon wanted to hire her as a private nurse for Minjun during his recovery. He was offering a salary that was more than she made in a year, a figure so absurd it felt like a dream. He was impressed by her professionalism, the man said, a phrase that felt entirely inadequate to describe the cold interrogation she'd endured. "He feels his son would be most comfortable with you," Thea's mind raced. This was insane. It was dangerous. Everything Chloe had said was true. But then she remembered Minjun's small hand in hers, the flicker of life in his eyes when he'd first started to warm up. She thought of that sterile, cold mansion that was likely his home. He needed warmth. He needed someone who saw him as a child, not as the heir to a dangerous empire. Against every rational instinct, against Chloe's frantic, silent head shaking, she heard herself say, "Okay, I'll do it." The house was less a home and more a monument to wealth and silence. It was a sprawling structure of glass and dark stone, set back from the road behind a formidable iron gate. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the soft, deferential footsteps of the staff. The air was cool and still, the decor minimalist to the point of being sterile. Polished marble floors reflected the gray winter light from floor-to-ceiling windows, and priceless art hung on the walls like lonely prisoners. It was beautiful, opulent, and utterly devoid of warmth. Thea felt like an intruder, her worn sneakers a sacrilege on the pristine floors. A severe-looking housekeeper led her upstairs to Minjun's room. The room itself was enormous, larger than Thea's entire apartment, and filled with every toy a child could possibly desire. But the toys were neatly arranged on shelves, untouched. A state-of-the-art gaming system sat dark and silent. It was a showroom, not a child's bedroom. Minjun was sitting on the edge of his bed, a small, solitary figure dwarfed by the scale of the room. He looked up when she entered, his dark eyes wide and watchful. He didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. "Hello, Minjun," Thea said softly, her voice feeling too loud in the oppressive quiet.
"I'm Thea."
"I'm going to be helping you feel better," he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. And so her new life began. She consciously ignored the grandeur of the house, the ever-present, silent guards posted discreetly in the hallways, and the intimidating presence of Jinwoo Quan, who seemed to watch her from the shadows, a ghost in his own home. She focused entirely on the boy. She brought a small, portable speaker and played soft music. She found a pad of paper and some colored pencils and sat on the floor, drawing simple cartoons, not asking him to join but leaving the invitation open in the space between them. She read stories aloud, her voice a warm, steady presence in the cold, quiet room. She didn't push him to talk, didn't overwhelm him with questions. She simply existed, a calm and gentle constant in his silent world, waiting patiently for him to come to her. Weeks melted into a quiet routine. Thea would arrive each morning, her cheerful "good morning," Minjun echoing slightly in the vast hallway, and spend the day in his room, creating a small bubble of warmth within the cold fortress of the house. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to see the cracks in the boy's shell. It started with small things. He would leave a specific book on his pillow, a silent request for the story he wanted to hear. He began to watch her draw, his gaze intense and curious. Then one afternoon, as she was sketching a clumsy-looking dog, he slid off his bed and sat on the floor beside her. He didn't speak, but he picked up a blue pencil and began to draw on a fresh sheet of paper. Thea's heart swelled, but she kept her expression calm, not wanting to spook him. She just kept drawing, their pencils scratching against paper the only sound in the room. His drawings were dark at first, filled with solitary figures and stark, empty landscapes. They were a window into his lonely world. But gradually they began to change. One day, he held up a drawing for her to see. It showed two stick figures. One was small and drawn in black. The other was taller, colored in a vibrant green, and it was holding the smaller figure's hand. Thea felt a lump form in her throat. Later that week, as she was tucking him into bed, he spoke his first full sentence to her, his voice a small, hesitant whisper. "Will you stay?" The question was so simple, yet it held the weight of all his unspoken fears. Thea smoothed his hair back from his forehead, her touch gentle. "I'll stay as long as you need me, Minjun," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. She didn't realize they weren't alone until a shadow fell across the doorway. Jinwoo stood there, his expression unreadable as always, but she knew he had heard. He didn't acknowledge the tender moment he'd witnessed. Instead, he cleared his throat and asked, "Has he finished his dinner?" It was a mundane, normal question, the kind any parent might ask. But coming from him, stripped of its usual cold, transactional edge, it felt like a seismic shift. It was the first time he had spoken to her as something other than an employee. It was a beginning. The kitchen became their neutral ground, a place of unspoken truces late at night. It was the one room in the house that felt remotely lived in, with its gleaming steel appliances and the faint, lingering scent of food. Thea was there one evening, long after Minjun had fallen asleep, warming a glass of milk she hoped would help him sleep through the night without nightmares. She was so focused on her task, she didn't hear Jinwoo enter. "He's been sleeping better," he said, his voice startling her. She turned to find him leaning against the doorframe, his tie loosened, his suit jacket gone. In the soft glow of the under-cabinet lighting, he looked younger, less like a fearsome tycoon, and more like a man carrying an impossible weight. She simply nodded. He had a good day. "We built a castle out of blocks." A faint ghost of a smile touched Jinwoo's lips before vanishing. He pushed off the doorframe and walked over to the large window, staring out at the dark, snow-covered grounds. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy with things unsaid. "It was the anniversary," he said suddenly, his voice flat, his gaze still fixed on the darkness outside. "The day he was in the park. It was the anniversary of my wife's death." The confession landed in the quiet kitchen with stunning force. Thea stood frozen, the warm glass of milk forgotten in her hand. "He was with his nanny," Jinwoo continued, his voice a monotone recital of facts that couldn't hide the raw guilt beneath. "I was distracted. I wasn't paying attention. I've built this empire, this fortress, to keep him safe. And in the end, he was almost lost because I was drowning in my own grief." He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were dark pools of self-recrimination. "I see the way he is. Quiet. Old before his time. I've given him everything except the one thing he needs. A father. I'm afraid this world I've built for him is breaking him." Thea's heart ached for this powerful man, so utterly lost in his own pain. She walked over and set the milk on the counter. She didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. She offered him the simple, unvarnished truth. "He knows you love him," she said softly. "And you're not failing him. You're here now. That's what matters." That late-night confession in the kitchen changed everything. The invisible wall between them, built of his grief and her professional distance, had crumbled. Jinwoo no longer watched her from the shadows. He sought her out. The conversations started small, questions about Minjun's progress that slowly bled into questions about her. He asked about her nursing program, her dream of specializing in pediatric oncology. He listened, truly listened, with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she never had before. He started coming home earlier, his imposing briefcase and grim expression replaced by a cautious hopefulness. He would appear in the doorway of Minjun's room and just watch them, a silent observer to the warmth and laughter Thea had brought into the house. One night, a piercing scream shattered the house's tranquility. A nightmare. Thea was out of her chair in an instant, but as she reached Minjun's door, she found Jinwoo was already there, his face pale with alarm. They went in together. Minjun was sitting bolt upright in bed, his face streaked with tears, his small body trembling. Thea sat on one side of him, murmuring soothing words, while Jinwoo sat on the other, his large hand resting gently on his son's back. They were a team, a united front against the monsters in the dark. As Minjun's sobs subsided, and he drifted back to a peaceful sleep, his small hand clutching tightly to Thea's, she looked up and met Jinwoo's gaze across the dimly lit room. The air was thick with unspoken emotions, a current of gratitude, admiration, and something deeper, something more fragile, passing between them. He slowly reached across the bed, his fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before they gently brushed against her arm. The touch was electric, a jolt of warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice raw and heavy with meaning. "For everything. You brought light back into this house." He wasn't just talking about the lamps she left on, or the colorful drawings now taped to the walls. He was talking about the light in his son's eyes and the unfamiliar flicker of hope that had begun to kindle in his own chest. Thea was no longer just the nurse. The title had become an ill-fitting garment for the role she now played in their lives. She was a confidant, a playmate, a steadying presence. The formal lines of employer and employee had blurred into the soft, undefined edges of something that felt remarkably like family. They started eating dinner together, the three of them, at the massive dining table that had once seemed so intimidating. Now it was just a table, a place where Jin-woo would recount a story from his day, where Min-jun would proudly explain the intricate rules of a new game he'd invented, and where Thea would laugh, a sound that bounced off the high ceilings and filled the room with life. The house itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. It was still a mansion, but it was no longer a sterile museum. Min-jun's colorful drawings now adorned the refrigerator, a bright, cheerful rebellion against the sleek stainless steel. His laughter, once a rarity, became a common sound, echoing down the long hallways. Jin-woo changed most of all. The guarded, intimidating mask was gone, replaced by a soft watchfulness, an easy smile that reached his eyes whenever he looked at Thea or his son. He delegated more of his work, his phone now a tool for ordering pizza instead of commanding his empire. He was present, truly present, in a way Thea suspected he hadn't been for a very long time. Chloe came to visit one Saturday, her jaw practically hitting the polished floor when Jin-woo himself opened the door, dressed in a soft gray sweater instead of a suit, with Min-jun hiding shyly behind his legs. Later, as Thea made them coffee in the kitchen, Chloe leaned against the counter, her expression a mixture of awe and affection. "Okay, I take it all back," she whispered. "You didn't just tame the beast. You reminded him how to be human." One evening, as they were cleaning up after dinner, Jin-woo stopped her, his expression serious. "I need to terminate your employment," he said, and Thea's heart plummeted. He must have seen the shock on her face, because he quickly added, his voice soft, "You can't be an employee here anymore, Thea. Because this is your home now. If you'll have it." Months later, the snow was falling again. Thea watched the thick, fluffy flakes drift past the massive living room window, a serene and silent ballet. But this time, the cold held no menace. It was just weather, a beautiful backdrop to the warmth inside. A fire crackled and popped in the grand stone hearth, casting a dancing, golden glow across the room. The air smelled of pine wood and contentment. Min-jun was fast asleep on the plush sofa, his head resting comfortably in Thea's lap. His face was peaceful, all traces of the lonely, frightened boy she'd found in the fountain completely gone. She ran her fingers gently through his soft, dark hair, a wave of fierce, protective love washing over her. Jin-woo sat beside her, so close their shoulders were touching. He wasn't reading or looking at his phone. He was just watching her, his expression one of such profound peace and gratitude that it made her breath catch. He reached over and took her free hand, lacing his fingers through hers. His touch was familiar now, a comforting anchor. He didn't speak for a long time, the only sounds being the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. "I never knew," he said finally, his voice a low, intimate murmur meant only for her. "I never understood what a home was supposed to feel like. I thought it was about safety, about walls and security systems." He turned his head, his dark eyes locking with hers. "I was wrong. It's this. It's warmth. It's you." He squeezed her hand gently. "You didn't just save my son that night, Thea. You saved me from a life of shadows. You saved us both." A slow, genuine smile spread across her face. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the gesture feeling as natural and necessary as breathing. The powerful mafia boss, the lonely child, the young nurse, they were just Jin-woo, Min-jun, and Thea now. A family forged not in a boardroom or by blood, but in the crucible of a crisis, built on an act of kindness and cemented by the slow, patient, and miraculous work of healing. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a pristine, quiet white, a symbol of a new and hopeful beginning.